I want you to pay attention to something you might not have noticed about yourself. When you make a joke, especially a joke about your own life, what story are you telling? Because here's what I've discovered in decades of listening to the human soul. Your humor is not random. It's not just entertainment. Every time you laugh at yourself, every time you deflect with comedy, every time you turn your pain into a punchline, you're confessing something. You're revealing which chapter of your life you're still trapped in, even though you think you've moved on. You see, we believe we've changed. We tell ourselves we've grown past our old wounds, that we're no longer the person who got rejected, abandoned, humiliated, or broken. We wear new clothes, take on new jobs, enter new relationships, and we genuinely believe we've become someone new. But then you make a joke, and that joke, my friend, that seemingly innocent moment of laughter, it betrays you. It points directly back to a version of yourself you swore you left behind. This is not a small thing. This is not trivial. Because what lives in your unconscious doesn't stay hidden. It seeps through the cracks of your carefully constructed persona, and one of its favorite escape routes is humor. You think you're being clever, self-deprecating, relatable, but what you're actually doing is retelling an old story about who you are. You're reinforcing a narrative that was written when you were younger, more vulnerable, less aware. And every time you tell that joke, you're signing your name to that old contract again. I've sat with countless people who wondered why they couldn't move forward, why the same patterns kept emerging in their lives, why they felt stuck despite all their efforts to change. And often, when we dig deeper, we find it there in the jokes they tell. The man who constantly jokes about being a loser is still living in the shadow of his father's disappointment. The woman who makes herself small through humor is still protecting herself from the cruelty she experienced as a girl. The person who turns everything into irony is still afraid to be sincere because sincerity once got them hurt. Your unconscious is speaking through your humor. And until you learn to listen to what you're really saying, you'll keep giving away your power to a story that no longer serves you. So let's learn to listen. Let's discover what your jokes are trying to tell you. Because once you hear it, once you truly understand what you've been confessing all along, you can finally choose a different story. You can finally become who you actually are, not who you were forced to become. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. You're thinking, Carl, they're just jokes. You're reading too much into this. Sometimes a joke is just a joke. And I understand that resistance. I do. Because accepting what I'm telling you means accepting that you're less in control than you thought. It means admitting that parts of you are still running old programming, still operating from old wounds, still speaking from old identities. But let me be clear about something. I'm not asking you to stop having a sense of humor. I'm not suggesting that laughter is somehow suspect or that joy is a disguise. Humor is one of the most beautiful capacities we have as human beings. It connects us. It helps us cope. It allows us to hold difficult truths lightly enough that we don't break under their weight. What I'm pointing to is something more subtle, more specific. I'm talking about the repetitive patterns in your humor, the jokes you tell over and over again, the subjects you always return to, the ways you consistently describe yourself when you're trying to get a laugh. These patterns are not random. They're not just your sense of humor. They're windows into your unconscious. They're breadcrumbs leading back to unfinished business. Think about the people you know. Really, think about them. Don't you notice how each person has their signature jokes? The friend who always plays the fool. The colleague who constantly jokes about how chaotic their life is. The family member who can only talk about their achievements through a filter of self-mockery. These aren't random comedic choices. They're protective strategies. They're ways of controlling the narrative before someone else can. When you joke about being disorganized, you're beating others to the judgment. When you joke about being unlovable, you're protecting yourself from real rejection by making it seem like you don't care. When you joke about your failures, you're trying to diminish their power over you. But here's the paradox. Every time you make that joke, you're actually reinforcing the very thing you're trying to transcend. This is what I call the repetition compulsion. It's our unconscious need to return to familiar territory, even when that territory hurts us. We repeat what we haven't resolved. We revisit what we haven't integrated. And we do it in ways that feel safe, ways that feel like we're in control. Humor is one of those ways. It gives us the illusion that we've mastered our pain by making light of it. But mastery and avoidance are not the same thing. Let me tell you about a patient I once worked with. A brilliant man. Truly gifted. But he had this habit of introducing himself at parties by saying, "I'm the family disappointment." He'd say it with a smile, with perfect timing, and people would laugh. They'd think he was charming, self-aware, humble even. But I heard something else. I heard a wound that had never healed. As we worked together, we discovered that this joke, this throwaway line he'd used hundreds of times, was actually the organizing principle of his entire life. His father had been a prominent figure, successful in ways that cast a long shadow. And my patient had internalized the belief, very early on, that he could never measure up. So, instead of trying and risking genuine failure, he preemptively declared himself a disappointment. He made it his brand, his joke. The problem was, every time he told that joke, he was reinforcing a self-concept built on a child's misunderstanding. He was an adult now, with his own accomplishments, his own path. But emotionally, psychologically, he was still that boy desperately seeking approval from a father who couldn't give it. The joke kept him locked in that old story, and this is what happens to all of us in different ways. We develop these verbal tics, these comedic habits, and we think they're harmless. We think they're just part of our personality, but they're actually symptoms. They're signs that some part of us is still living in the past, still operating from an outdated understanding of who we are. Your unconscious doesn't forget. It doesn't move on just because you consciously decide to. It holds on to everything. Every wound, every rejection, every moment of shame or fear. And it expresses these holdings in symbolic ways. Dreams are one way, symptoms are another, and yes, humor is another. Your jokes are dreams you tell while awake. They're coded messages from parts of yourself that haven't caught up to your current life. So when I ask you to pay attention to your jokes, I'm really asking you to become curious about yourself in a deeper way. I'm asking you to wonder, what am I really saying when I say that? What belief am I reinforcing? What story am I keeping alive? And most importantly, is this still true? Is this still who I am? Or am I simply repeating a story that once made sense but no longer fits? This kind of self-inquiry takes courage. It's much easier to keep joking, keep deflecting, keep pretending that everything's fine. But fine is not the same as whole. Fine is not the same as authentic. And if you want to live fully, if you want to break free from the invisible chains of your past, you have to be willing to look at how you're keeping yourself bound. You think you're making choices, but often, you're running on autopilot. The scripts written decades ago, the roles you were given before you even knew you had a self. And the strange thing is, the prison looks like freedom. You call it loyalty. You call it love. You call it just being responsible. But underneath, there's a quiet suffocation, a tension you've learned not to name. Think about the mother who never allows herself to rest. She's always doing, always caring, always available. She doesn't ask for help because she doesn't believe she deserves it. She tells herself, "This is what mothers do." But really, she's playing the martyr she watched her own mother play. She's performing exhaustion as proof of love. And her children will learn from her too. They'll learn that love means self-erasure, that needs are burdens, that visibility requires suffering. Or consider the man who can never accept vulnerability in himself. He's competent, strong, always in control. When he feels sadness, he translates it into anger. When he feels fear, he becomes silent. He learned early that emotion was weakness, that real men endure without complaint. So he endures, and endures, until one day, his body forces the issue. Illness, collapse. The body always speaks what the mind refuses to acknowledge. These aren't moral failures. They're inherited wounds. And what makes them so dangerous is that they feel normal. They feel like who you are. You don't recognize them as patterns because they're woven into the fabric of your identity. They're the water you've been swimming in your entire life. But here's the truth I want you to understand. Awareness changes everything. The moment you see the pattern, you're no longer fully inside it. The moment you recognize the script, you can choose whether to keep reading from it. This doesn't mean the pattern disappears. It doesn't mean you're instantly free, but it means you've created space. And in that space, choice becomes possible. Let me tell you what happens in that space. At first, it feels strange, even uncomfortable. Because you've been running on autopilot for so long, that conscious choice feels like learning to walk again. You reach for your phone, and instead of the automatic scroll, there's a pause, a question. Asterisk. Do I actually want this right now? Asterisk. That pause is everything. I've seen people describe it as waking up in their own life. Like they've been a passenger, and suddenly, they're offered the steering wheel. The car is still moving. The road is still there. But now you can choose the direction. Here's what most people don't realize. The shadow doesn't want to be rejected. It wants to be times integrated. Asterisk. That restless part of you that craves stimulation. It's not evil. It's trying to tell you something. Maybe it's bored because you're not being challenged. Maybe it's anxious because you're avoiding something important. Maybe it's lonely because you've replaced real connection with digital noise. When you stop numbing it with dopamine, you can finally hear what it's saying. I remember working with a man, brilliant mind, successful career, who spent every evening lost in YouTube videos. Not educational content. Just noise. Mukbangs, drama channels, reaction videos to reaction videos. He called it relaxing. But when we dug deeper, what he was really doing was avoiding the silence, because in the silence, he'd have to face the fact that he was deeply unsatisfied with his marriage. The content wasn't the problem. It was the shield. Once he recognized this, once he could say, "I'm using this to hide," something shifted. He didn't immediately fix his marriage. He didn't even stop watching videos right away, but he stopped lying to himself about what he was doing. And that honesty, that was the crack where light got in. This is the paradox. When you stop fighting your cravings and start questioning them, they lose their grip. Because a craving that's understood is no longer unconscious. And what's conscious can be chosen or not chosen. You start to notice patterns. You reach for distraction when you're tired, or when you're avoiding a difficult conversation, or when you're feeling inadequate and need a hit of someone else's curated perfection to confirm your unworthiness. Each time you notice, you're pulling back the curtain. And here's what makes this practice revolutionary. You're not trying to stop the behavior through willpower. You're not wrestling with the shadow through sheer force. You're doing something far more sophisticated. You're becoming curious about it. You're treating it like a scientist observing a fascinating phenomenon rather than a moral failure demanding punishment. The shadow doesn't respond well to condemnation. When you shame yourself for your phone addiction, when you berate yourself for wasting another evening scrolling, you're actually feeding the very mechanism that keeps you trapped. The shame creates psychological tension. And that tension demands relief, which your brain has learned to find in the very behavior you're condemning. It's a perfect, self-sustaining loop. But curiosity breaks the loop when you approach your behavior with genuine interest. Isn't that fascinating? I'm reaching for my phone again. What am I feeling right now? What am I trying not to feel? What? You create a gap between impulse and action. And in that gap, consciousness can enter. I've watched this transformation countless times. The person who begins by saying, "I can't control my phone use," gradually shifts to, "I notice I reach for my phone when I'm anxious." That single shift from helpless victim to interested observer changes everything. It means the unconscious pattern is becoming conscious. It means the shadow is being seen. Now, let's go deeper. Because the phone is just the delivery mechanism. What's really happening is that you've outsourced your psychic regulation to an algorithm. Every round, time you feel uncomfortable, bored, lonely, anxious, uncertain, instead of developing your own internal capacity to be with that discomfort, you reach for external stimulation. The phone becomes a prosthetic for the psychological muscles you've never developed. Think about what humans did before this technology existed. When you were bored, you daydreamed. You let your mind wander. You stared out windows and made up stories. This wasn't wasted time, this was the psyche doing essential work. You were learning to hold space for yourself, to be present with your own existence without needing to justify every moment with productivity. The boredom was teaching you something that no achievement ever could, that you are enough, simply as you are, without doing anything at all. But the modern world has pathologized this natural rhythm. Now, if a child sits quietly, parents grow anxious. If a teenager stares into space, there must be something wrong. We've medicalized the very states that once produced our greatest thinkers, our deepest artists, our most profound spiritual seekers. And so we fill every gap. We optimize every minute. We turn life into a spreadsheet of accomplishments, each hour accounted for, each moment monetized or measured. The soul has become an employee of the ego, clocking in and out, never allowed to simply times be asterisk. What we've lost is the understanding that consciousness needs fallow periods, just as soil needs rest between harvests. The psyche cannot endlessly produce without time to restore itself. The symbols and insights that emerge from the unconscious need silence to make themselves heard. When you constantly flood your awareness with external input notifications, news, entertainment, other people's thoughts and lives, you create a kind of psychic noise pollution. The quiet voice of the self cannot compete with this cacophony. It withdraws, waiting for a moment that never comes. This is why so many people feel disconnected from themselves despite being hyper-connected to everything else. They know everyone's opinions but have forgotten their own. They've consumed 1,000 think pieces but haven't had an original thought in months. The signal of their authentic self has been drowned out by static. And here's the tragedy. They interpret this disconnection as a problem to be solved through more consumption, more podcasts, more courses, more content about finding yourself. They're trying to fill an inner void with external material, like pouring water into a basket and wondering why they're still thirsty. The answer is simpler and more difficult than they imagine. Asterisk. Stop. Asterisk. Simply stop. Create deliberate, structured emptiness in your life. Not as a treat or reward, but as a non-negotiable practice, as essential as breathing. This isn't about meditation apps or guided exercises, though these can help. It's about reclaiming hours of your life for unstructured, unproductive, seemingly useless time. Time where nothing happens, and no one is watching, and you're not improving yourself or working toward any goal. Your psyche needs this emptiness, the way your lungs need air. Without it, you begin to suffocate under the weight of constant stimulation, constant productivity, constant self-optimization. You become a machine that has forgotten it was once human. I've watched brilliant minds collapse not from overwork, but from overstimulation. They filled every gap with podcasts, every silence with music, every moment of potential boredom with scrolling, and then one day, they looked up and realized they couldn't remember the last time they had an original thought. Every idea in their head was a remix of someone else's content. The unconscious speaks in whispers, not shouts. It communicates through subtle feelings, through images that arise unbidden, through thoughts that seem to come from nowhere. But you can only hear these whispers in silence. When you're constantly consuming other people's words, other people's thoughts, other people's carefully curated realities, there's no space left for your own inner voice. This is why so many people report their best ideas coming in the shower, or on a long walk, or just before falling asleep. These are the rare moments when the input stops, when the defenses come down, when the unconscious finally has a chance to be heard. But what if, instead of waiting for these accidental moments of silence, you created them intentionally? What if you treated solitude not as a problem to be solved, but as a resource to be cultivated? Start small. 1 hour a week where you do nothing productive. No phone, no book, no music, no agenda. Just you and your own mind. Sit, walk, stare out a window. Let yourself be bored. Let thoughts arise and pass without judgment. You'll be shocked at what emerges. Old memories, unresolved feelings, creative ideas, insights about relationships. The very things you've been seeking through endless consumption have. You've been waiting inside you all along, desperate for your attention. And here's what troubles me most deeply. You've become convinced that you're choosing this behavior, that you're freely deciding to check your phone, to open another tab, to scroll just a little more. But I must ask you, have you ever truly observed this action? As it happens, the hand reaches for the phone without conscious instruction. The fingers unlock the screen through muscle memory alone. You find yourself staring at content you don't remember seeking, feeling emotions you didn't consent to feel. This is not choice, my friend. This is compulsion, wearing the mask of agency. In my work, I encountered many patients who believed themselves free while living in invisible prisons. The alcoholic who insisted he could stop anytime. The obsessive who claimed his rituals were simply preferences. They all shared this same delusion, that the pattern serving them had not become their master. This ancient trick. They've discovered that true control never announces itself as control. It whispers instead that you're the one in charge, that you can stop whenever you wish, that just one more scroll won't hurt, and you believe it. Even as days dissolve into weeks, weeks into months, months into years of your finite life spent in this peculiar trance. But consciousness, true consciousness, requires distance. It requires the ability to step back and observe yourself without judgment, to watch your own hand reaching for the phone and ask, who is making this decision? What is this action serving? What am I avoiding by engaging in this behavior right now? These questions terrify the ego. They threaten to reveal that the emperor has no clothes, that the self-directed individual you believe yourself to be has been operating on autopilot for far longer than you'd care to admit. Yet this terror is the doorway to freedom, because you cannot change what you cannot see. You cannot break a pattern you haven't acknowledged, and you cannot reclaim your attention until you recognize how completely you've surrendered it. The silence I keep returning to, it's not empty. It's full of these uncomfortable revelations. But here's what happens when you actually begin this reclamation. You start noticing the withdrawal symptoms. That's what they are, actual withdrawal symptoms from stimulation. You sit down without your phone, and within 90 seconds your hands start reaching for it. Not because something happened, not because you need information, just because the absence of input has become unbearable. I've watched myself do this hundreds of times. I'll decide to read for 30 minutes without checking anything, and at minute 3, I'm convinced that something important is happening somewhere that I'm missing. This isn't intuition. It's addiction, presenting itself as urgency. The mind creates false emergencies to justify returning to the feed, and society reinforces this beautifully. We've reframed constant availability as virtue. If you don't respond immediately, you're rude. If you don't stay informed about every crisis, you're privileged. If you take time away from connectivity, you're selfish. We've moralized the very behaviors that fragment our consciousness. The brilliant trick is that it feels like engagement. You're reading about social issues, staying informed about politics, keeping up with your field. This is productivity, right? This is being a responsible, aware person. Except you're not actually engaging with anything. You're skimming surfaces, collecting positions, performing awareness. Real engagement requires sustained attention, which is precisely what the system prevents. I notice this, especially with complex topics. I'll see an article about something genuinely important: climate policy, economic inequality, technological ethics, and I'll read it. Or rather, my eyes will move across the words while my mind is already anticipating the next thing. By the end, I have just enough information to have an opinion, but nowhere near enough to genuinely understand the issue. And I'll scroll to the next thing feeling informed, which is perhaps the most dangerous illusion of all. This is what we mistake for learning. This is what we call staying informed. But true learning, true understanding, requires something we've almost entirely abandoned: the willingness to sit with complexity without immediately resolving it into a position we can defend. I remember reading a study years ago about how people respond to information that contradicts their beliefs. The researchers found something remarkable. When confronted with evidence that challenged their worldview, people didn't change their minds. Instead, their original beliefs became times stronger asterisk. The psychologists called it the backfire effect. The more facts you presented, the more entrenched people became. At first, this seemed irrational to me. Why would more information make us less times informed? But then I understood. It's not about the information. It's about what the information threatens. We don't hold beliefs because they're true. We hold them because they organize our world, because they tell us who we are, who our tribe is, who the enemy is. To change a belief isn't to change a thought. It's to change an identity. And the psyche will defend identity with the same ferocity that the body defends against poison. So, we've built an entire information ecosystem that never challenges us. Algorithms that learn what we like and show us more of it. News sources that align with our existing views. Social circles that echo our opinions back to us with approval. We call this personalization. We celebrate it as innovation. But what we've actually created is a technology for preventing transformation. Because transformation requires what we fear most: uncertainty. It requires the terrifying middle space where you've let go of one understanding but haven't yet grasped another. Where you're suspended between identities, between worlds, not knowing who you'll be when you emerge. The ancient Greeks had mystery schools that understood this. Before initiation, candidates would sit in darkness, in silence, sometimes for days. They called it times nekuia, times the descent into the underworld. You had to die to your old self before you could be born into knowledge. Understanding wasn't information transfer. It was metamorphosis. This is why the modern educational system so often fails to produce wisdom. It transmits data. Yes, mountains of it. But it does not transform the receiver. A student can memorize the periodic table, recite Shakespeare, solve differential equations, all while remaining fundamentally unchanged in their being. The information passes through them like water through a sieve. The ancient methods understood something we have forgotten: that real knowledge requires sacrifice. You cannot learn to be courageous by reading about courage. You must face the dragon. You cannot understand compassion through lectures on empathy. You must sit with suffering your own and others until it breaks something open inside you. I have watched thousands of patients in my practice, and the pattern is always the same. Those who experience genuine transformation are not the ones who accumulated the most insights or heard the cleverest interpretations. They are the ones who descended into their own underworld and stayed there long enough to be dismembered and reassembled. There's a moment in every real analysis when the patient realizes that understanding their problem will not be enough. They must become different. The alcoholic who finally grasps that willpower and knowledge of consequences cannot save them, that their entire relationship with reality must shift. The person trapped in toxic patterns who sees that knowing why they repeat these patterns changes nothing unless they're willing to endure the terrifying uncertainty of new behavior. This is what the initiatory trials were designed to create: a death of the old self, so complete that return to the former state becomes impossible. The knowledge gained is inseparable from the ordeal endured. Try to describe the color blue to someone who has never seen. Try to explain the taste of salt. Some things can only be known through direct experience. And some experiences require you to risk everything. In our therapeutic work, we sometimes encounter what I call the false initiation. The patient who performs the rituals of transformation without allowing themselves to be transformed. They speak the language of insight, display all the signs of progress, but somewhere deep down, they have maintained a escape route, a secret door back to who they were. Real initiation burns those bridges. You go forward into the unknown, or you perish. There is no retreat. The modern world offers you safety nets everywhere. Psychological theories that explain away your suffering. Self-help systems that promise transformation without sacrifice. Spiritual bypassing, disguised as enlightenment. These are not paths, they are comforts, designed to keep you circling the same mountain, never ascending. I see it constantly in my practice. People come seeking change, but what they truly want is validation. They want me to tell them their neurosis is justified, that their suffering is special, that they can heal without facing the very thing that terrifies them most. But the unconscious doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about your comfort or your timeline. The alchemists understood this. They spoke of the times, nigredo times, the blackening, the putrefaction. Before gold can emerge, everything must first rot. The false self, the ego's cherished illusions, the stories you've told yourself about who you are, all of it must decompose in the darkness. This is not metaphor. This is the actual psychological experience of anyone who dares to individuate. You will have moments where you genuinely cannot tell if you're going mad or becoming sane, where the boundary between self and other dissolves so completely you lose all reference points, where you meet aspects of yourself so alien, so disturbing, that you question whether they could possibly belong to you. These are not signs that something has gone wrong. These are the initiation itself. And here's what no one tells you. You cannot schedule this. You cannot fit it between your morning routine and your afternoon meetings. The unconscious erupts on its own timeline, following patterns far older than your personal convenience. When it comes, you must drop everything and attend to it, or it will find increasingly destructive ways to get your attention. I've watched people try to manage their individuation like a project, with goals and milestones and measurable outcomes. It never works. The psyche laughs at your spreadsheets. It sends dreams that unravel months of careful planning. It arranges synchronicities that demolish your certainties. It demands that you sacrifice the very thing you thought you were working toward. This is the nature of psychological transformation. It never moves in the direction you expect. You plan to become more confident, and instead, you're stripped of all your masks. You intend to develop your career, and instead you're forced to confront why you've been running from intimacy. You think you're working on one thing, and the unconscious reveals that you've been avoiding the real work entirely. I have watched this process unfold in countless lives. The young man who came to me wanting to overcome his shyness, only to discover that his reticence was protecting him from his own grandiosity, his secret belief that he was destined for something so extraordinary that ordinary human connection felt beneath him. The cure was not confidence. It was humility. The woman who sought to heal her anxiety, convinced it was a symptom to be eliminated, who eventually understood that her nervousness was the only honest part of her, the only thing that refused to participate in the elaborate fiction she had constructed about her marriage, her choices, her life. You cannot choose what the self will demand of you. You can only choose whether to listen or to continue running. And running, I assure you, becomes more exhausting with each passing year. The ego has remarkable endurance for this flight. It will construct philosophy after philosophy to justify its position. It will find teachers who confirm its prejudices, books that validate its direction, communities that applaud its choices. The modern world offers endless opportunities for this kind of collusion. You can surround yourself entirely with voices that tell you that you are right, that your path is correct, that your understanding is sufficient. But the self is patient in a way that outlasts all these constructions. It waits in your insomnia. It speaks in your inexplicable sadness. It manifests in the strange accident that changes everything, the illness that forces stillness, the loss that destroys your carefully built world. You may call this cruel. I call it love. A love that refuses to abandon you to your half-lived life, that will not allow you to die without having truly existed. The Christian mystics understood this paradox intimately. They spoke of the dark night of the soul, not as punishment, but as preparation, the stripping away of false consolations so that genuine faith might emerge. What appears as divine abandonment is actually divine intimacy. A closeness so intense it feels like annihilation. The psyche operates by this same terrible mercy. I have watched countless individuals cling desperately to personas that no longer serve them, identities inherited rather than chosen. The successful businessman who secretly dreams of painting, the dutiful daughter suffocating under expectations, never questioned. The skeptic whose rationality has become a prison against wonder. Each builds elaborate defenses against their own becoming, terrified of what they might discover in the depths. Then catastrophe arrives. Not always dramatic. Sometimes it is simply the accumulation of unlived life reaching critical mass. The body rebels. Relationships shatter. Meaning evaporates from pursuits that once seemed essential. You find yourself at 3 in the morning, staring into darkness, asking questions you have spent decades avoiding. Who am I beyond these roles? What do I truly value? What have I sacrificed to maintain this acceptable image? This is the moment the self has been engineering all along. The crisis is not evidence of failure, but of awakening. Your unconscious has finally gathered enough strength to challenge the tyranny of your conscious attitudes. It is saying, with ruthless compassion, the life you have been living is too small for what you contain. The invitation, then, is not to fix yourself, not to return to how things were. That would be to misunderstand entirely. The breakdown is the breakthrough attempting to happen. What needs to die is not you but your identification with who you thought you had to be. This death is sacred. It creates space for something more authentic to emerge. But here, we encounter the greatest resistance. We have been taught that stability is the goal, that change is failure, that a good life is one of predictable continuity. So we medicate the anxiety, distract ourselves from the depression, force ourselves back into roles that no longer fit. We treat the symptoms and wonder why they intensify. But what if the symptoms are not the enemy? What if they are messengers, carrying vital information from the depths of your being? The anxiety that wakes you at 3 in the morning is not a malfunction. It is your soul knocking on the door of consciousness, demanding to be heard. The restlessness that makes familiar surroundings feel like a cage is not pathology. It is the psyche's rejection of patterns that have become prisons. I have observed this countless times in my practice. A successful banker comes to me, paralyzed by panic attacks that seem to have no rational cause. His life, by all external measures, is enviable. Yet his body revolts against the very routine he has constructed. We could pathologize this response. Certainly. We could call it generalized anxiety disorder and prescribe accordingly. But when we listen, truly listen to what the anxiety is saying, we discover that it is protecting him from a slow death of the spirit. His panic is not random. It is precise. It occurs when he is about to repeat patterns that violate something essential within him. A woman enters the second half of her life and finds herself crying without apparent reason. Her friends suggest hormones. Her doctor suggests antidepressants, but neither touches the truth. The tears are not symptoms of deficiency, they are the soul mourning the life she has not lived, the selves she has suppressed to maintain the image of who she was supposed to be. The depression lifts not when we silence the tears, but when she finally grants herself permission to become someone new. This is the paradox that our rational minds struggle to accept. Sometimes, the breakdown is the breakthrough. Sometimes, the crisis is not the problem, but the solution beginning to emerge. We are so invested in maintaining the structure of our lives that we resist the very transformations that would save us. The alchemists understood this profoundly. They spoke of the times nigredo asterisk, the blackening, the stage where the material must be broken down completely before transformation can occur. They weren't speaking metaphorically about chemicals in a flask, they were describing the essential process of psychological transformation that you and I must undergo. When you find yourself in the dark night, you are in the nigredo asterisk. The person you thought you were is dissolving. The beliefs that structured your reality are crumbling. And every instinct screams at you to rebuild, to restore, to return to what was. But the alchemists knew, you cannot skip this stage. You cannot rush through the darkness toward the light. The darkness itself is doing necessary work. I have watched countless individuals fight this process with every tool at their disposal. They medicate the symptoms. They distract themselves with work, with pleasure, with constant motion. They perform elaborate rituals of positivity, plastering affirmations over the cracks in their foundation. And I understand why the Times, nigredo times, is terrifying. It feels like death because, in a very real sense, it is death. The death of who you were. But here is what I observed time and again in my practice. Those who surrendered to the process, who stopped fighting the dissolution, and instead allowed themselves to fully experience it, emerged, transformed. Not improved versions of their old selves, but genuinely new beings, with access to resources and strengths they never knew existed. The woman who came to me after her marriage collapsed, whose entire identity had been built around being someone's wife and someone's partner. She spent months in the Times nigredo asterisk, feeling utterly lost. But when she stopped trying to immediately rebuild, stopped grasping for a new relationship to fill the void, something remarkable happened. She discovered parts of herself that had been dormant for decades, creativity she had abandoned, ambitions she had suppressed, a capacity for solitude that eventually became a source of profound strength, rather than something to be feared. What I find particularly striking in reflecting upon these transformations is how often we discover that what we believed to be our authentic self was merely a well-rehearsed performance for an audience we never consciously chose. The woman who thought she loved being the center of attention, always entertaining, always on, discovers in her solitude that she actually finds deep peace in quiet contemplation. The man who believed his worth resided in being needed by everyone realizes he had simply become addicted to the fleeting validation of being indispensable. The authentic self does not announce itself with trumpets and proclamations. It emerges quietly, almost shyly, once the noise of social performance diminishes. I remember a conversation with a patient who described this awakening with remarkable clarity. She said, "I spent 40 years believing I was an extrovert because I could talk to anyone about anything. But after my divorce, when I finally stopped performing, I realized I had been exhausting myself daily. What I actually craved was depth, not breadth, long silences with one trusted friend, rather than clever banter with a room full of acquaintances." This distinction is crucial. The false self is often louder, more socially palatable, easier to explain at dinner parties. The authentic self may be quieter, stranger, more difficult to articulate. It does not fit neatly into the categories that society has prepared for us, and here we encounter one of the great paradoxes of this solitary journey. You undertake it alone. Yes, you must walk through your own inner landscape without a guide. But the person who emerges from this wilderness is actually more capable of genuine connection than before, not the superficial connections of social obligation, but the rare and precious connections that occur when two authentic selves recognize each other across the darkness. The isolated performance artist becomes capable of true intimacy. The man who thought he needed to solve everyone's problems becomes capable of simply being present with another's pain without the compulsion to fix it. These transformations are not sudden enlightenments. They are gradual awakenings, like eyes adjusting to light after years in darkness. The shadow work continues throughout life, each layer revealing another beneath it, each integration preparing you for the next descent. I have watched people in their 70s discover shadow elements they had hidden for half a century. A retired businessman, finally confronting the artist he suppressed at 25. A grandmother acknowledging the rage she channeled into passive control for decades. The work has no expiration date. Your unconscious will wait as long as necessary, but it will not forget. Recond. 1. 1. 1. The question that matters is not whether you will face your shadow eventually. The question is, how much of your life you will spend running from it. How many years will you invest in the exhausting performance of being someone you are not? How many relationships will you sabotage? How much energy will you waste in projection and denial? Because here is what I must tell you plainly. Every moment spent avoiding the shadow is a moment stolen from your actual life. Every day you refuse to look at what you have hidden is a day you cannot be fully present, fully authentic, fully alive. The shadow does not rest simply because you ignore it. It continues its work in the background, influencing your choices, limiting your possibilities, shaping your existence according to patterns you do not consciously recognize. And perhaps most tragically, the qualities you most need, the strengths that would most serve your unique path through this world, are often exactly what you have hidden in the shadow. The sensitivity you were told was weakness. The ambition you were taught was selfishness. The playfulness you learned was inappropriate. The firmness you believed was cruelty. Your liberation lives in the very place you fear to look. This is why the journey, though difficult, is not optional for those who wish to live consciously. You can choose comfort over growth, certainty over truth, the familiar cage over the unknown freedom. Many do, but you cannot choose unconsciousness and wholeness simultaneously. You cannot refuse the descent and expect to reach your full height. You will wonder if this journey is worth it. You will compare yourself to others who seem lighter, unburdened, moving through life with enviable ease. They have not descended. They have not faced their dragons. And yes, perhaps they sleep better at night. Perhaps they laugh more freely. But there is a difference between the laughter of innocence and the laughter of one who has returned from the underworld. The first is the laughter of not knowing. The second is the laughter of having known, having survived, and choosing joy anyway. That second laughter, it has weight. It has roots. It cannot be taken from you by circumstance. I have seen people achieve remarkable things while remaining fundamentally unconscious. They build empires on the foundation of their wounds without ever examining them. They become successful, influential, even beloved. But there is always something missing. A hollowness at the center. A performance of wholeness rather than wholeness itself. True individuation requires that you stop performing. It requires that you cease the exhausting theater of being who you think you should be and simply become who you are. This is far more difficult than it sounds. We have been performing for so long that we have forgotten what our authentic movements feel like. The shadow will teach you again, if you let it. Every rejected part of yourself is trying to guide you back to authenticity. The anger you suppress holds information about your boundaries. The sadness you deny holds information about your losses. The desires you judge hold information about your unlived life. When you integrate these parts, something remarkable happens. You become less fragmented, less at war with yourself. The energy you once spent on internal conflict becomes available for creativity, for love, for presence. You discover that you have far more capacity than you realized, because you are no longer dividing yourself against yourself. This is the practical magic of shadow work. Not mystical transcendence, but psychological integration. Not floating above your humanity, but standing fully within it. Not becoming perfect, but becoming whole. And wholeness, I promise you, is far more valuable than perfection ever could be. Because perfection is static. Wholeness is alive. Perfection isolates you. Wholeness connects you to yourself, to others, to the great mystery of existence. Perfection is a prison of your own making. Wholeness is freedom. And this freedom, this wholeness, begins with a single, courageous act. Acknowledgement. You must look at what you have buried. Not with shame, not with the intention to fix or erase, but with the simple willingness to see. I remember a patient who came to me in despair. She was an accomplished woman, respected, admired, yet inside, she felt hollow. "I have done everything right," she told me. "Why do I feel so empty?" We began to explore her dreams. In them, a wild woman appeared, dancing naked in the forest, laughing with abandon, breaking every rule. My patient was horrified by these dreams. "That is not me," she insisted. But I asked her, "Is it not?" Over time, she began to understand. The wild woman was not her enemy. It was the part of her she had sacrificed to become acceptable. Her spontaneity, her desire, her rage. She had built her identity on being good, being proper, being safe. And in doing so, she had lost her aliveness. The work was not to become that wild woman. The work was to let her exist, to give her a seat at the table of the self. To say, "You, too, are part of me." This is what integration demands. Not choice between opposites, but room for both. You are kind and capable of cruelty. You are generous and selfish. You are brave and terrified. These are not contradictions to be resolved. They are tensions to be held. The self is not a monument. It is a living, breathing paradox. And when you can hold that paradox without collapsing into one side or the other, something miraculous happens. You become real. Not the persona you show the world, not the shadow you hide in darkness, but the whole, imperfect, magnificent creature you actually are. This is what I mean when I speak of individuation. It is not self-improvement. It is self-realization, the full acknowledgement of what is, not the fantasy of what should be. You stop asking, "How can I be better?" You start asking, "How can I be more fully myself?" And that question, that shift, changes everything. Because when you stop pretending, you stop performing. And when you stop performing, you stop exhausting yourself trying to maintain an image that was never real to begin with. You begin to live from the inside out, rather than the outside in. You stop measuring yourself against the noise of the world and start listening to the quiet voice within the one that's been drowned out for years by expectation, comparison, and the relentless hum of not enough. This is where true individuation begins. Not in perfection, not in arrival, but in the honest, messy, ongoing work of becoming who you already are beneath all the layers you've wrapped around yourself. And here's what I observed time and time again. The people who do this work, who face their shadow, integrate their contradictions, stop performing their life, they don't become less, they become more present, more real, more alive. They laugh harder. They cry without shame. They speak the truth, even when their voice shakes. They allow themselves to be seen, flaws and all, because they've finally stopped believing that their worth depends on being flawless. And paradoxically, they become more magnetic, not because they're trying to impress anyone, but because authenticity is rare. And when someone shows up fully as themselves, without apology, without pretense, it gives everyone around them permission to do the same. You stop being a mirror of what others want. You become a window into what's possible. And yes, some people will be uncomfortable with this version of you. Some will prefer the mask. Some will miss the person you were pretending to be, because that version was easier to control, easier to predict, easier to fit into their own narrative. Let them go. Because the people who truly belong in your life, the ones who matter, they won't want your shadow hidden. They'll want your wholeness. They'll see your darkness and not flinch. They'll witness your contradictions and love you not despite them, but because of them. This is intimacy, not the shallow performance of connection, but the deep, terrifying, beautiful act of being fully known.